Indonesia is a nation of about 17,000 islands. It's the world's largest archipelago. And for decades, its waters have been a playground for illegal fishing boats. That changed to a large degree in 2014 when Indonesia initiated an aggressive crackdown that was led by a woman named Susi Pujiastuti, who was appointed in that year to head the Federal Fisheries Agency. I met Susi in Washington, D.C. at an event where we both spoke, hosted by the U.S. State Department, and she invited me to come to Indonesia and take a look at what she was trying to do. And so about 8 months later, I took her up on the offer and spent a week with her patrol vessels at sea. Before we headed to sea, I spent the day at one of the country's 5 detention centers where crews are held when the Indonesian government arrests illegal fishing boats. I was on an island called Pontianak, and I was particularly interested to take a look at what had been described to me as sea refugees, which are men, mostly deckhands, who were stuck in this administrative gap, sometimes for years. Since they had no say over where their ships fished, these men were not criminal detainees, and they were supposed to be efficiently repatriated as undocumented immigrants. But having willfully signed on to the ships, these men were also not trafficking victims, which meant they did not usually get help in the repatriation process from organizations like the UN. What that meant was a lot of guys stuck in detention facilities who were not really charged with any crime, but who were nonetheless stuck there, sometimes for years. And I had heard that this was a widespread problem throughout the South China Sea area, and quite especially in Indonesia. So before we went on patrols, I asked to visit one of these facilities and talk to some of the detainees. I was struck to find the vast majority of the detainees were from Vietnam. I'd expected to find Thai or Burmese or Taiwanese, but almost all of them were Vietnamese. One of the things that emerged as I interviewed some of these workers was that many of the detainees said that they had not realized they were in Indonesian waters. And I was unsure whether to believe that claim. On the one hand, it seemed possible that these deckhands thought they were still in Vietnamese waters. On the other hand, when I talked to guards and when I talked to officials in Indonesia, they scoffed at that claim and said it's ridiculous. And of course they know where the border is, and more often than not, they were well within the border and knew full well that they were fishing illegally. I wasn't sure what to believe. The ship that I was on was called the Macan, and its captain was a man named Samson. Within hours after we launched, Samson saw on his radar a collection of illegal vessels and began to pursue them. When we got to the location that the radar indicated, Samson and his men immediately began pulling alongside these Vietnamese boats and ordering them to stop. All of them refused to stop at the outset, and Samson's men went through a series of steps, warning them to stop and then eventually firing on these boats. And usually that's when the Vietnamese boats would finally stop, and Samson's men then boarded the vessel, removed the crew, and brought them on board our ship as detainees. Each of the 5 Vietnamese boats had 11 men on them, and over the course of about 5 hours, Samson's ship went one by one and collected these crew and put an officer on the Vietnamese boat. And by the end of that very busy day, our ship had 55 Vietnamese detainees, and we began to head back to shore. Samson and his men, as we headed back, were delighted at a fairly productive trip, and there was a celebratory feel for a while until a call came in to the bridge, and it came from one of Samson's officers who was driving the last of the arrested Vietnamese boats in the convoy. And this officer, his name was Mas Gun, was yelling into the radio that he was under attack. Apparently, a large Vietnamese Coast Guard cutter had intersected him and split him off from the group, and he was now on the run, and the Vietnamese Coast Guard was chasing him. And he was calling for our help, saying that the Vietnamese Coast Guard was ramming his boat, and it was a much larger ship, and that he was likely to sink. We immediately U-turned and full throttle headed to where Mas Gun seemed to be located. When we got there, we found the Vietnamese Coast Guard ship was twice our size, and Mas Gun was no longer broadcasting on the radio, and the ship that he was driving was in the process of sinking. It was extremely tense. Samson, who doesn't speak English, was only able to communicate with me through a translator that I had brought, who happened to be a female. The Vietnamese Coast Guard officer on the radio did not speak Indonesian, only English. But the Indonesians did not want the translator, who was a female, to be the person on the radio representing them. So, somewhat reluctantly, I found myself as the intermediary between the Indonesians and the Vietnamese as they attempted to negotiate. On the one hand, the Vietnamese demanded that all of their men were released, and so were the ships. And the Vietnamese contended that those arrests were illegitimate because we were in Vietnamese waters. This news surprised me, and I asked to see maps. And the maps that I was shown by the Indonesians indicated we were well within the Indonesian waters. The Indonesians were willing to give the men back and the boats back. They just wanted their fisheries officer back, Mas Gun. And for a while, the Vietnamese wouldn't even tell us whether Mas Gun was alive and whether they had picked him out of the water. Eventually, they told us that he was, and he was on the bridge with them. And we began a long conversation about how to make this swap. The Indonesian officer for the arrested Vietnamese detainees. During that negotiation, all hell broke loose on the back of our ship, and the 55 detained Vietnamese fishermen began jumping overboard and swimming toward the Vietnamese Coast Guard ship, hoping to be rescued. It was pure chaos, and I watched as the Vietnamese fishermen who jumped in the water attempted to swim to the Vietnamese Coast Guard ship, and then realized they had no way to climb on board because it was a very large ship with tall sides. And so they then instead turned and swam towards the sinking fishing boat, which was still protruding somewhat from the water. And I remember thinking that I was probably going to witness people drowning right in front of me. That did not happen, thankfully. Some of the worst swimmers returned to our ship and climbed back on board, realizing they couldn't make the distance. And so in the end, we had 11 detainees left on our ship. The others clung to the sinking fishing boat and were eventually picked up by the Vietnamese Coast Guard. Meanwhile, negotiations continued on the bridge. Sampson had contacted Jakarta to get instructions from the Foreign Ministry office and the head of the Navy as to what he should do. Jakarta informed us that there was no help coming. We were too far away for the Navy to get to us in time, and we should leave the scene immediately and leave Moscoon in the hands of the Vietnamese, something that Sampson promptly refused to do. So we stayed there and continued to try to negotiate Moscoon's release until 2 blips appeared on the radar screen. These blips were hard to figure out, to discern, but they were clearly large vessels that were inbound in our direction, and they looked to be Vietnamese vessels. The theory on the bridge of our ship was that this was reinforcements that were on the way to back up the Vietnamese Coast Guard ship, and we were about to be in worse trouble than we already were, and likely all of us would be detained. So Sampson had a tough decision to make. Jakarta had already told him to leave the scene immediately and let the diplomats handle a later negotiation for the release of Moscoon. And now that instruction took on new urgency because it looked like the Vietnamese were sending reinforcements. Jakarta called again and in firm terms told Sampson that he was to leave immediately, and he did just that. We headed to an island called Batam as fast as we could. We dropped the detainees off, and in the subsequent weeks, the Indonesian government negotiated with the Vietnamese government, and Moscoon was eventually flown back to Indonesia. As we headed back to shore, I found a chance to talk to some of the Vietnamese detainees on Sampson's ship, and I asked them about whether they knew they had been fishing illegally and whether they saw themselves as fishing in Indonesian waters or Vietnamese waters. And it was as if the question didn't make any sense to them, and 2 of them made a comment that fish don't obey national borders. So why should fishermen? The expression that I heard was, "Fish are from God, we only borrow them from Indonesia," which I guess is a common thing that Vietnamese say when stopped by the Indonesians. And it struck me as sort of an echo of what I had heard from the Vietnamese who were at the Pontianak shelter, who had said that they didn't see themselves as fishing illegally, and they weren't even aware that they were in Indonesian waters because they didn't really pay attention to those lines. And so this whole issue of borders stuck with me. When I got back to the United States, I reached out to several naval historians and asked them to take a look at the GPS coordinates of where we were and tell me, quite simply, were we in Indonesian or Vietnamese waters? The response I got was interesting. Indonesia and Vietnam don't recognize where the others draw the line, and so the maritime border between the 2 countries is contested and quite murky. And so really the answer to my question of whose waters were we in was, it depends on who you ask. And once again, I found myself thinking about this issue of borders and sort of the peril or murkiness of drawing lines on water.